Happy Wednesday, everybody. AM Ocala Live. You're listening to WOCA, The Source, 96.3 FM, 1370 AM. As we are now 10 minutes past the 10 o'clock hour. And with that, we just wrapped up with talking with Laura Burns, Career Source, as they're one of our proud sponsors. And with Career Source, as of last week, and we read that article in lieu of everything going through with the reemployment assistance that if you tried to do through the Connect system via online, they had been running into the issues of such, but they've upped what they needed to in lieu of servers and manpower to make it as better as they can. But with that in mind, they've partnered with Career Source, the state has, to help with the assistance in that. And that's what she was on here to talk about. And a lot of good stuff, nonetheless, that she mentioned that can help out for those who need that right now. And the best thing to do, like she mentioned, for everything that they have to offer via the website at careersourceclm.com. And like I said there before the break, is I navigated the website very easily once I typed in careersourceclm.com. All of the prompts that she was describing are right there to click on in lieu of the assistance to get the application that's necessary to file your claim, to get that rolling. Although we do know that the mail may take a little bit longer in the sense of getting that process, but nonetheless it will still be processed, which is different than not having it done at all. So we want to give thanks to Laura Burns, and thank you for the information and everything else with it, as we now discussed it a little bit last week and now talked about it then this week too there. So a lot of good stuff nonetheless. So thank you very much. As we move along with our show now, being after the 10 o'clock hour, it is time for our segment of On This Day in History, as we've been doing this quite often with the show, which is a good way to spawn some ideas of interesting facts that have taken place in history. And I always deem it appropriate because we are living through history right now in lieu of this worldwide pandemic, making our own, so to speak, in this year of 2020, in this new decade, in this new year. And it's crazy. We're already through, like we said, getting halfway through the first full week of April, and with all the expectations to get through this month, to talk about getting maybe back to some normalcy through the month of May. And to already think about that, though, would be that we're already talking about May, which means we're getting halfway through this year already, which I know some people are like, let's just get through it all together and welcome 2021 after how the word of the pandemic has been tumultuous. This has been. But nonetheless, on this date in history, as we take a look here, going back to 1904 to begin our year in history, to give ourselves all the way up to 2013. So as we go here on this date in history, April 8th, 1904, Longacre Square in Manhattan, New York, gets its rename and becomes Times Square. How about that? It was 1904 on this date that it becomes Times Square, and obviously Times Square is one of the big novelties when visiting New York City. As we know, also it's always highlighted at the end and beginning of every year as everybody fills in Times Square for the ball drop for the new year, as it was called Longacre Square in Manhattan. Was on this date in 1904 that it was renamed to Times Square. So how about that? On this date, moving into 1935, as we've always, we read history on the show that talks about maybe some other times that have been as difficult as a nation getting through something, and it's always fascinating how it resonates through and through. So it was on this date, April 8th, 1935, that the Emergency Relief Appropriation Act, as a part of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's, quote, New Deal, the Emergency Relief Appropriation Act creates the WPA, or the Works Progress Administration, for creating government jobs for some of the nation's many, many unemployed. The WPA employed more than 8.5 million people on 1.5 million public projects before it was eventually disbanded in 1943. As the WPA, or Works Progress Administration, creating these government jobs, all due to the many unemployed. And it's amazing how that rings in today in the idea of everything we're dealing with the pandemic, and people who have been laid off, and some people who have lost their jobs in its entirety and may not be going back to, as we see the downturn in the economy with it and everything else. But just like we did back then, worked our way through it to good times, we could see that maybe coming through to fruition at some point here soon. So it was 1935, the Emergency Relief Appropriation Act was put into the New Deal from Franklin Delano Roosevelt on this date in history. Moving on to April 8th, 1952, steel plants under federal control. It was in 1952 on this date, with a threatened steelworkers strike, President Truman used his presidential power to place the steel plants under his control, which led to a battle before the Supreme Court in June of that year, when the Supreme Court ruled that the president had overstepped his authority. It was in 1952 that President Truman used his presidential power to place the steel plants under his control, as it was the threatened steel workers for the strike, as he took of that. And then it was a few months later that the Supreme Court ruled that he had overstepped his authority. Interesting. On a lighter side of it, as we're all, maybe some of us, most Americans, I'd say, would be at this point starving for some sports, which brings up good old history of sports. And this is a great one here. This is fantastic, and I can see the image in my mind here as I've seen it on highlight reels before. But it was on this date, April 8th, in 1974, that Henry Hank Aaron of the Atlanta Braves hit his 715th career home run, breaking Babe Ruth's legendary record of 714 home runs. So it was on this date in history, in 1974, that Hammerin' Hank Aaron hit his 715th career home run. I could see him run on the bases, and that's when some people jumped out of the stands to come and actually shake his hand as he was rounding third base, as it was a remarkable feat in history, as we know how baseball is a predominant staple within our country, and the history that baseball has, and everybody knowing Babe Ruth, and then having that record be broken, which is absolutely incredible, which many people talk of it, never being to that extent again. So it was on this date, 1974. On this date in 1986, moving to a darker side of it, if you will, it was 1986 that the Germany terrorist bomb attack. It was April 8th, 1986, that a terrorist bomb attack on American servicemen in Berlin disco had left 2 dead and 100 injured. The attacks are believed to be, or had to be, from a Libyan terrorist group. That it was on this date in 1986 that there was a terrorist bomb attack in Germany, in Berlin, on an American serviceman that left 2 dead and 100 injured. So it's 1986. On the same day in 1986 of April 8th, 1986, Mayor Clint Eastwood, residents of the California town of Carmel, having overly voted for actor Clint Eastwood as their mayor, as Clint Eastwood became the mayor of Carmel in 1986 in California. So that man is absolutely incredible in the things he's done in his life, and now we're talking, well over 30 years ago that took place, and what he's been doing since. That man works hard, that's for sure. I don't have Carlos here, as I did the intern that we've been having, as we make jokes that I think it was about a week ago or so, or 2 weeks ago, we had mentioned that he didn't know who Clint Eastwood was. So that's just a little jab at him now, as mentioning Clint Eastwood. And I guess at the end of the day, I could have said, you never heard of Mayor Clint Eastwood? On this date, 1986, Mayor Clint Eastwood, resident of the California town of Carmel, was overly, in a landslide, voted as mayor. In 1992, on this date, April 8th, 1992, it was brought up, I just seen on a special with sports of ESPN, that in 1992, it was tennis legend Arthur Ashe, was diagnosed with AIDS. It had been announced that he had AIDS on this date in 1992. Arthur Ashe, an incredible tennis player and the only black man to win Wimbledon, and the center court in Flushing Meadows in New York City for the U.S. Open. The center court is named after him, Arthur Ashe, and it was on this date in 1992 that he announced that he had AIDS. Moving on, in 1994, on this date in 1994, and a somber note here for music fans, it was April 8th, 1994, that rock musician Kurt Cobain had committed suicide as he was found with a single shotgun wound to the head. A gun and a suicide note were found nearby. That was on this date in 1994. Lead singer of the band Nirvana and legendary, became legendary, so to speak, after this, but talented genius singer-songwriter Kurt Cobain, of the frontman for the band Nirvana, had committed suicide, and it was from then that with drummer Dave Grohl from the band eventually moved on to form the band Foo Fighters. From there, became extremely popular and amazing to the idea of where he came from, having his friend go through that. So on this date, 1994, Kurt Cobain, rock musician Kurt Cobain, had committed suicide with the band Nirvana. Moving on to 2006, it was on this date, April 8th, 2006, that the Senate has not approved the compromise bill that was designed for millions of illegal immigrants to become citizens. It says the immigration bill blocked in the Senate as it was not approved that the compromise bill was designed for millions of illegal immigrants to become citizens. The bill's supporters were only able to muster up 38 of the 60 votes that were needed to protect it from amendments that its opponents had introduced. Both parties had been blamed each other for the deal's collapse. So it was 2006 that the Senate blocked the immigration compromise bill. 2006. Moving on, just a few years later, 2008. On this date, April 8th, 2008, the U.S. Homeland Security Chief warns of the cyber attacks. It says Michael Chertoff, the Homeland Security Chief, had asked Silicon Valley workers to help in the fight to secure this cyber highway. He told San Francisco's RSA conference that threats of cyberspace are on a, quote, a par this country tragically experienced are on par this country has tragically experienced in 9/11. He elaborated, saying that such attacks could hit financial bodies and a government's powers. Quote, we take threats to the cyber world as seriously as we take threats to the material world. The government is shutting down thousands of points from which outsiders could access federal computer networks to only about 50. He compared this to a digital Manhattan Project in terms of impact and importance. So that's interesting. Homeland Security Chief warns of cyber attacks on this date in 2008 as he told San Francisco's RSA conference about the threats, using some big quotes in there to heavily-handed get the word across. Moving to 2012, on a somber note here. In 2012, on this date, April 8th, 2012, it was Mike Wallace, famous for his interviews on the U.S. news program 60 Minutes, had died at the age of 93 after suffering poor health for several years. Wallace was one of the original hosts of the program when it started in 1968 and worked there until he announced his retirement all the way up into 2006. Some of his most famous interviews included talking to Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Yasser Arafat, and Jack Kevorkian. So it was unfortunately on this date in 2012 that Mike Wallace had passed away, although living to 93 years old and having done 60 Minutes for as long as he did, starting in 1968 all the way to 2006, was an absolutely incredible journey in life. as it was, as one of the most renowned journalists of his time and probably in history, Mike Wallace. In moving on a little bit to 2013, with a little bit more of a summer note too, is the United Kingdom. Margaret Thatcher had passed away and died on 2013, April 8th, 2013. Former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Baroness Margaret Thatcher, died at the age of 87 after suffering from a stroke. Thatcher had served as the Prime Minister from the United Kingdom between 1979 and 1990. As a leader of the Conservative Party, she was the first female Prime Minister in the country. So it was on this date, April 8th, 2013, which, when you mention 2013, it doesn't sound that far away, but we're talking 7 years ago that it was Margaret Thatcher had passed away. Another incredible life of 87 years, and having taken the position as Prime Minister in the United Kingdom as the first female Prime Minister in the country from 1979 to 1979 and 1990. A little bit of other history in lieu of some other stuff here. It says, born on this day, April 8th. It was a birthday to Viviana Westwood, which is the grand dame of fashion, who made the English punk style popular after the Sex Pistols wore clothes from Westwood and McLaren's shop in Kings Road in London at their first gig. Punk clothes and style included bondage gear, safety pins, razor blades, bicycle or lavatory chains on clothing, and spiked dog collars, chains as jewelry, as well as outrageous makeup and hair. She's continued to outrage and outshine other fashion designers by not following the yearly trends and colors, but always going her own way. She was and still a political activist and is outspoken in her views of clothing. And what's interesting about that is it's just from Webmaster says, I never really got the punk music or the clothes or the style, but the respect her for staying true to her individualism, even at the age of 75 years old. So that's Viviana Westwood, as kind of introducing the fashion for punk clothes or punk rock there in the late 80s with the Sex Pistols, as that became as a big trend there for quite a while. Interesting. So there you go. As we wrapped up on this day in history, just some interesting facts to give everybody an idea to think about as we went back to 1904. It's on this date, 1904, that Times Square was named Times Square after it was Longacre Square in Manhattan, as it was renamed on this date in 1904. We moved to 1935, where it was a little bit fitting to mention that it was the Emergency Relief Appropriation Act. It's part of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal that got the Works Program Administration for creating government jobs with having unemployed Americans unemployed with so many of the nation's unemployed, as it employed more than 8.5 million persons. In 1952 was the steel plant's federal control, as President Truman had threatened with a threatened steelworkers strike. President Truman took that power to place the steel plants under his control on this date. On the side of baseball and sports is 1974. It was this date that Hammerin' Hank Aaron had hit his 715th career home run, breaking Babe Ruth's legendary record of 714. In 1986, it was a German terrorist bomb attack in Berlin that left 2 dead and 100 injured. On the same day in the same year, U.S. Mayor Clint Eastwood, residents in a landslide, overwhelmingly voted in the town of Carmel, California, for Clint Eastwood as their mayor. It was in 1992 that Arthur Ashe had publicly announced that he had AIDS. In 94, Kurt Cobain taking his life, and so on and so on. So as we come towards the bottom of the 10 o'clock hour, WOCA Ocala will be back right after this. Stay tuned.
Fox News, I'm Chris Foster. After saying he'd frozen money to the World Health Organization, President Trump says later he's considering doing that over what he calls a slow response to the coronavirus pandemic.
Where it came from, the extent of it, how serious it was, they never viewed it as that serious.
The president with Fox's Sean Hannity. Vice President Pence says the Centers for Disease Control may relax some guidelines for people who've been exposed to the virus and do not show symptoms.
The circumstances under which they might be able to return back to work using some facial protection and monitoring their temperature.
We're close to 400,000 confirmed COVID-19 cases in the United States now, with nearly 13,000 deaths, 4,000 of those in New York City. Taliban leaders walk out of peace talks with Afghanistan's government, accusing it of delaying a prisoner swap negotiated with the United States. America's listening to Fox News.
If you're a pro, Lowe's knows how hard you work every day. So it's important that others are working hard for you.